Okay, good afternoon, and welcome to Modernization Best Practices. My name is Jason Oker. I'm a principal at Source Logic. We are a Pega implementation partner and a proud sponsor of today's event. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, there are two things that our company is primarily known for. Number one is that our applications always make it to production, and number two, the hard problems tend to find us. So given that modernization is one of those things I would call a hard problem, we were ecstatic when Pega asked us to put together a panel for today's event. So we didn't just put together any panel, but we went out and we found three of the foremost experts in their field, and they're here today to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that organizations face during modernization. So what do you think about when you think about modernization? Do you think about going from a mainframe to client server, to the web, to maybe mobile or the Internet of Things? Or do you think of the proverbial dumpster fire? There's not a day that goes by that you don't see a news story or a headline about a failed modernization initiative. This one right here is one of my favorites. And when you think about it, what makes modernization so complex? Why do these projects tend to fail? If you look at Dimers, for example, this was a 10-year program. So think about the pace of technological innovation and the pace of change. 10 years ago, actually 8 years ago, we had the cool president because he had a BlackBerry. 10 years ago, the iPhone didn't exist. Today we have the iPhone version 7. 10 years ago, Facebook didn't exist, or it existed only if you were at a select set of schools. Pluto was still actually a planet. So what then can we do, right? So what makes things different? What makes this so complex? Today we're seeing really an unparalleled, at least in my lifetime, an unparalleled pace of technological innovation. It permeates every aspect of our life. It's changed the way we commute. It's changed the way that we travel. It changes the way we shop. It even changes the way we date and our social interactions. So how then can organizations overcome this change? How can organizations deal with this level of complexity? So what we're going to talk about today, a couple of things. So first is, how do we manage policy, governance, and change in the age of disruption? So we're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about how do we manage end user expectations when we're implementing a modernization effort. In today's kind of on-demand society, we expect everything, not 5 years from now, but we want Uber and Amazon and Facebook. We want it today. We don't want it 5, 10 years down the line. And what's technology going to look like by the time that those systems get rolled out? And then the last part of this that we're going to explore today is, I'm sure that a lot of people in this audience got the same letter that I got, which was, Dear Mr. Noker, we are sorry to inform you that the Chinese are now in possession of your fingerprints, your social security number, and God knows what else. So the world that we live in today demands that security is part of everything that we do. So how do we balance functionality with risk? So as more devices come on the network and as more people are exposed to applications, organizations are going to have thousands, or in some case, hundreds of thousands of devices connected to the network. And how do we balance that level of functionality with risk? So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And lastly, the days of the billion-dollar boondoggle are over. So in today's budgetary constrained environment, we have to do more with less. We have to deliver systems and functionality that are secure in months, not years. And that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. So with that, I talked a little bit about we take on the hard challenges. Our esteemed panel today is going to take those challenges on head on. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to my partner and our moderators today, Mr. Harry Clark.
Thank you, Jason. Am I live? All right, so welcome to our panel and thank you for coming. So in keeping with what James Lawless did in the early session this morning, we're going to have three very specific themes that we're going to address in our modernization panel today. A little bit different than a panel this morning, we are going to have a subject matter expert for each of the themes. Now, the other panel members may participate in certain questions, but we're going to try to do three very specific, thorny, tough issues around modernization and go deep enough in each one of those where you will each get some value out of it. So with that, let me talk about our themes and let me talk about the associated panel members. So the first theme is modernization policy, governance, organizational issues, and best practices. So at the far end of the panel is a gentleman named Eric Charles. So Eric has over 20 years of technical leadership in dealing with these kinds of challenges. And we've personally worked with Eric over the last, I guess, 8 or 9 years at the Department of Transportation, Department of Treasury, and the U.S. Census Bureau. Eric has held, since I've known him, about every kind of technical leadership position you can have. He's been a chief engineer, he's been a chief architect, and he's been a chief enterprise architect, all on different enterprise modernization initiatives. Eric also has extensive understanding of low-code technologies and specifically business process management, intelligent business process management. So that makes him a perfect fit for this panel. And Eric also has a very extensive background in working with the various, I'm going to call it, lines of business leaders throughout the agencies that I talk about. So we'll get into questions with Eric in just a few minutes, but welcome Eric, and let me introduce the other panel members. All right, so our second theme is best practices for successfully managing a large-scale modernization application development project or projects. And for that, we have a great panel member expert, and it's Patrick Grau. Patrick's right here in the middle. So Patrick represents Accenture Federal Services, and we've had the pleasure of working alongside Patrick on a number of projects, and he's simply exceptional at what he does. So currently, he's an Agile Program Manager for the Department of Justice client, and he is Accenture's Federal PEGA certified subject matter expert and certified senior systems architect. Prior to taking this role, he also was in the private sector with leadership in the similar kinds of projects, both in the insurance and banking industry. And last, I'll read this directly off his bio, but Patrick says he self-identifies as a team builder who focuses on relationship building through transparency. So I can tell you, since we have multiple people working from SRC Logic or Source Logic working with him right now, you do an exceptional job of team building, and our people always love being a part of your team and working on your projects. So we're happy to have you here. All right, so right to my right is a gentleman that is exceptional at what he does. So I'm going to introduce this topic this way, and it's one that hasn't got a lot of focus today. Nothing creates an agency-level crisis faster than major cyber breaches and issues. And Jason talked about that in the introduction. So what are the best practices for managing modernization cybersecurity? So Mark currently is the Chief Security Officer and Senior Vice President at IronNet Cybersecurity. Before that, he was the president of Ronin Analytics. And really, when I first started working with Mark, he was the executive director of plans and policies for U.S. Cyber Command. Prior to that, he was the special counsel for Defense Intelligence and permanent select committee on intelligence at the U.S. House of Representatives. He's held multiple positions with NSA focusing on signal intelligence. He's a naval aviator. He's an attorney and member of the bar in Maryland, and he's also a senior fellow at George Washington University's Center for Cyber and Homeland Security. So that's our panel. Please welcome them. All right, so we're going to go through each of the 3 themes that we have. And at the end, we will leave plenty of room for questions. So if you would, let's hold the questions for the panel members till the end, and then they're all yours. All right, so let's start with Eric Charles. Is that okay, Eric? I'm going to go with you first. So let's talk about discussing governance, policy, and organizational issues created by these large-scale modernization projects. So, Eric, here's the first question that we have for you. How do you assess the process change? And what I mean by that, it's the way that government agencies work associated with these modernization projects, and how do you deal with the associated impacts?
Sure. Well, thanks, Harry, and thanks to the audience for joining us today. From a preparation perspective, there are several dimensions, right? The first one that comes to mind is, excuse me, the human factors. So how do we assess skill gaps and provide and plan for fulfilling those skill gaps? How do we look at organizational processes, internal governance and control mechanisms, and how do we tailor those to adapt to a new reality? And then thirdly, how do we ensure we do so in a very cost-effective manner? So the first approach would be to ensure, as we bring on board new ways of doing things and we introduce new processes, like we transition, for instance, from traditional development paradigms into low-code platforms, how do we ensure that our key subject matter experts, our lead developers, our architects, understand that transition, plan for it, and most importantly, are on board with it? And secondly, we also have to guard against folks feeling that the organizational value is threatened. How do we keep our key business analysts, our subject matter experts bought into the vision and moving that vision along? And then thirdly, how do we ensure that we plan in terms of adopting effective roadmap strategies to ensure that we deliver on the promise of modernization, so it does not become a buzzword and it actually has real value to the organization? So at 3 dimensions, these approaches have been proven to be quite successful.
All right. So you've identified the process changes and what has to take place. And so then you've got the next step in that evolution, which is all of the change management to actually make that happen. And the issues are important, and they're sensitive. And not only do you have to lead an organization through those challenges, but it's very tricky to decide when you lead them through what elements. So Eric, keep going, and how do you get through those gates?
Sure, absolutely. Well, it may make sense to use like a real world example instead of just speaking in the abstract. So let's assume we typically do development work using traditional Java and .NET approaches, right? Slinging code as we refer to it. So typically we create siloed applications. We have different teams working in silos, creating applications, and then we go behind the scenes and try to integrate either through data integration or, system integration. Well, what if we change the paradigm completely and instead view our problem domain as end-to-end business processes, and we find opportunities in there to create processes and automated processes that give us insight into our activities, allow for high levels of accountability, and most importantly, allow for extensibility. That requires a dramatic change in the way we develop. So no longer are we looking at applications as strict silos and stuff with their own, resident data sets and stuff like that. But instead, we're looking at this as an end-to-end process that then will require an innovative approach to solutions. And the solutions typically take the form of intelligent business process systems. And we have a few of those, I guess, here at Newseum over the last day or two. So, Pegasystem comes to mind, and there are a few others in the market as well. But that's typically the approach that we would use, right? As we transition away from these siloed application development designs to more business process-oriented solution sets.
All right. So let's keep going, and let me take you one level deeper. So we get through the identification and the planning and the execution of the organizational changes, Eric. Mm-hmm. And then invariably there's a whole set of skills gaps at multiple levels in an organization, right, that you have to address.
Absolutely. How
do you step up to those?
I'll be happy to address those as well. And that's a very interesting question, because I believe the most important factor in any of these equations really is the human factor. How do you keep your current employees engaged? How do you retool and retrain if necessary? And more importantly, sometimes we have to make tough decisions. Is it more cost effective to retrain and retool, or should we outsource our developments to more capable providers? And this becomes this is a typical question of insource, outsource. More importantly, should we build, or should we go out to the market and look at a cut solution with built-in capabilities that we can leverage to shorten our development life cycles, to provide more value to the customer? These are critical decisions that need to be made, and of course, those will be supported through rigorous analysis and assessments. But more importantly, not just down at the level of the implementers. We need to ensure that our executive leadership understands the promise and the value of modernization. We have to ensure managers are trained so that they understand how to direct employees toward delivering greater value. There has to be an entire retooling, retraining, and a change of vision and paradigm across the entire stack of roles and responsibilities within an organization. And more importantly, in terms of process and internal governance, there are key pieces that need to be in place: transition plans, roadmaps. We have to identify applications that will be targeted for sunsetting and retirement, so that our efforts aren't simply adding to our portfolio of applications, but we're seeing a meaningful replacement of applications as they're being sunsetted and replaced with more cost-effective, more modern applications that add value to the organization. And not just value for the sake of value, but value in terms of enabling effective decision-making, enabling timely decision-making, and ensuring that we have more cost-effective solutions.
All right. So, Eric, one last question. So, 4 or 5 years ago, I hope it wasn't longer than that, we were working on a project at Department of Transportation, and we went on this journey that you just took us through. And then we ended up at the end with facing what I think is one of the toughest and most critical issues here. It's user adoption and user acceptance.
Right.
And you had kind of a really unique approach for stepping up to that. So talk a little bit about user adoption and user acceptance.
Right, exactly. Thanks a lot. So from that perspective, the perspective of user adoption and acceptance, typically, if a user has been using a particular application for a very long time, they tend to quote-unquote own it. They've learned the application's innards, they understand how it works, they've gained organizational value through the process. People refer to them as experts, people go to them for assistance. Imagine pulling that rug from under your end users and asking them to learn a new system, adapt to a new system. The question is, what's in it for them, right? So we have to ensure that our new and modernized applications offer high levels of user experience, that the user experience is compelling, so we have a higher rate of adoption. We have to ensure that these new systems actually enable and facilitate and improve upon the workflow of these users, and more importantly, that they empower the users to be more effective and more productive at their work. And of course, that ties in as well with the need to retool and retrain, because you only get that level of buy-in if you can convince your employees that their jobs are not at stake and that you're looking for them to embrace this new technology and run with it and evangelize it, Because if you have all these folks evangelizing a new solution, that makes your work so much simpler and so much more important in terms of getting the word out there.
Eric, nice job. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
All right. So you'll have time at the end to ask Eric questions. So let's now transition to our second theme with Patrick Grau. So Patrick, we're going to talk about managing these large, unwieldy, complex projects. And so let me tee you up in a really unfair way, but you'll do a great job of responding to it. So here it is. So it's a big 5 to 10 year program, and the government agency has thought about it. They've worked hard on it for years. It's gone through an RFI process. They've got all those ideas. It's gone through an RFP process. It's been demoed. It's been tested. And finally, it gets awarded. And everyone from the executive sponsors to the participants in the government program are all revved up and they're ready to go at 90 miles an hour. Bang, the project's yours. How do you handle it?
You have to get in the boat. That's the first and best way to put it. So if you walk in the door and you understand that mission because there's been so much prep work put into place, and then you coax your team, you get your team to join you and have them believe in that mission with you. You can't make anybody do that. You have to lead them to do that. You have the opportunity to get into that boat. And then once you're in the boat and everybody understands that you have the best interest of the program in mind, you look at those 3,000 to 8,000 requirements that are put in front of you and a fixed 5-year time frame that everybody has notionalized with a 1-year release. And then you build out of that what's called a minimum viable product, or MVP. Because in one of these programs that is supposed to take 5 years, you need quick wins, you need quick victories. So to get to that MVP, you look at where you can achieve in a relatively short period of time something that's tangible, something that's valuable that you can get out there. And then you challenge that MVP. And we actually do this on my current program about every 2 weeks, or as often as we can get everybody in the same room and look at a roadmap that's on a wall and sticky notes and say, well, what is actually the smallest increment that we can build value and release to our users to get valuable feedback. So you get that concurrence on what your minimum viable product is by being in the boat, by understanding what the values of the organization are, and truly believing in them, and truly supporting them. Then challenging what that smallest piece is, then challenging it again, and then challenging it again. But the second and third challenges you've built behind it. So what you must do to back the boat, back the belief in minimum viable product up with, is a quick delivery one. You have to actually succeed in demonstrating proficiency in the product, and then your understanding of that vision and executing it in the tool. In our case, it's Pega.
So, when I think of modernization and the projects we've been engaged in, some together, here's what it always seems like to me. And we heard this in this morning's panel. It's very interesting. Every bit of functionality that I as a user have, that I've gained over the last 10 years, I want to keep. And then to it, look, it's really not an issue at all. All I want you to do is add cloud, add big data, add analytics. By the way, I'd really like some social and unstructured analytics on that as well. And then I'd like seamless integration of mobile. And that's all I want in my MVP. So it's always what comes. And so how do so you don't want to tell the users no. We heard in the panel this morning, just say yes. But for you, this is something you can't say yes to. So how do you wrestle with that?
So you have to buy into, in our case, Agile principles. And specifically, it's letting the government own the decision as to what the most important thing to do is. So every time we look at what to pull into a sprint, which is a short, quick 2-week period of work that we accomplish, we actually give the power to the government to decide these are the most important things that you can do. And we work at our best effort, but we trust, we rely, and there's a bit of a trust fall every sprint to understand that, yes, we as the integrator, we don't control whether it's mobile first or analytics first or geospatial next. We actually give that power to the government, and we reap the benefit of that because we do the most important thing first. It's quite powerful.
All right, so in your last set of comments, Patrick, you talked about different types of work on a project. You talked about it could be geospatial, could be mobile, could be big data and analytics. And by definition, those require different types of resources to join your team. And of course, the simplest way for a project is we want everyone on the team up front and we want them to stay throughout, but that's not the way your projects work. So how do you wrestle with the resourcing challenges and get the government to buy in on it?
So one of the first and most important things that we do at Accenture is we build teams around people with multiple different skill sets. So if you look at our Scrum teams, they're composed of people that are both technical experts. And when we look at source logic, we've come to rely on the fact that I'll throw a shout out to my friend Dan and my friend Israel who are on our team. They bring a level of technical expertise to the table that we can count on. That hard technical approach that can be applied to any and all of those situations we just talked about. But then we also back it up with people that look at each of those different situations as a way to learn, a way to grow, and a way to challenge themselves. But the most important part is that if we see 6 to 8 months down the road an electronic content management function coming in, we will loud and clear communicate to the government that flexible staffing is needed. We'll need to bring in an expert for 3 months to design that. We'll need to bring in someone to join the team at that time. And we'll try to work that into the contract. And the way that we work with the government is very transparent. We don't have this need now, we'll need it then. So both flexible skills on our core team, but then flexible staffing when we actually need to bring those folks in who are true experts in the space.
So you do a great job. So Eric, you've lived through similar challenges in multiple engagements. Any other thoughts that you have?
Well, I completely agree with Harry's assessment. What I would like to add is simply the fact that sometimes when you have these blended teams, different skill sets, and especially the technical skills they need to be of the very highest quality, but also your business analyst, the folks who understand the business and more importantly the approach to extracting requirements. So there's this whole notion of domain-driven design, and this is something I think that has worked very well for us when we use that approach for eliciting requirements, defining the domain, and more importantly, building out solutions around domain-driven design. Just wanted to add that.
Good. All right, so Patrick, maybe last question. So they don't ever start this way, but it seems like these large modernization projects over time evolve where it's not just one agency, it may be 3 agencies that are involved. And it's not, when you're and you're managing it from an Accenture perspective as the prime contractor, you've got multiple agencies, you've got multiple vendors, you've got multiple subcontractors like us for different skills and things that are required at different times. And all this becomes incredibly complex, and of course you have to collaborate closely with the government. How do you wrestle through all of that as a big challenge?
Well, it is a big challenge. And when you take a look at a typical simple deployment at this point, you're likely to have in any government bureau, someone who's working on your production support, someone who's working on your hosting, someone who's working on your integrating, someone who's working on your requirements clarification, and on your driving of business process throughout the organization. And I'm giving you your question right back to you as a statement of truth. It's real, validated. When we as an integrator go in the door, it would be very easy for us to put up walls and say, this is, in fact, our space, this is our program. Getting back to the very first thing I said, you have to believe in the mission, and you have to get into the boat with your client. You have to be part of that team. What we do, and as a practice, is we work with the other folks who are in the building and who are across the street to make sure that if the government already has a strategy in place for how to deploy something to the cloud, whether it's a way that an image is built, or the way that a networking connection is performed, or the way that a content management tool is integrated into a program. We know that the government actually already owns that. So we use everything that we can in terms of our relationships and openness about our positioning to drive that collaboration government to government, and we let the contractors get out of the way. And in that case, we actually drive better value for the government by letting that collaboration happen and pretending, and in fact living, that we're all on that same team to get product out the door. By living that, it turns out you can actually do a lot of good by working together.
You all always do a good job on that, and we like being on your team. All right, so you'll have questions for Patrick at the end, so let's move to Mark. Mark, you feeling left out so far?
Insecure.
Okay. Well, it's your turn now. So let's start this way. So here you go. You're in one of your past roles in government. You can pick it. But someone that is a critical stakeholder comes to you and says, I've got this modernization project that I'm getting ready to dive into. What's your response?
Well, there's something that leaps to mind. I won't say it in front of this crowd, but let's just say it rhymes with grit. So it depends. It depends on all the factors that you're talking about. But just what comes to mind, having done some of these at the National Security Agency, is kind of to the comments that have been made before. What is this modernization effort going to do to my workflows? What are the dependencies on whatever it is you want to modernize? And especially, it raises the stakes just a little bit in the national security sphere. Who is going to be unhappy when whatever is operating now doesn't operate anymore? Even if I'm adding value to whatever it is I'm modernizing, someone's going to be unhappy along the way. So I'm trying to look down the road to say, how do I make that person happy? How do I reassure them that they're not going to lose that value or functionality? And how do I work with the contractor to make sure that the functions that are already in place continue? Or maybe let's have a strategic discussion about that particular function doesn't need to continue anymore because we're going to replace it with something that's even more powerful. And it just, I can't tell you how many times at Fort Meade where we looked at a number of different systems and we couldn't even remember why they existed. So we said, well, we need some efficiencies here, so what are we going to turn off? And we're like, well, we can't turn that one off because PACOM depends on that. We can't turn that off because CIA depends on that. We don't know who depends on this one, so let's yank the plug and see what happens. See who screams. So as a naval officer, I was disappointed when I yanked the plug on something, and it was the Navy who screamed. I had to kind of eat a little crow on that. But that's what runs through my mind. Oh boy, grit.
All right. So let's move to the policy and governance level. So you're responsible for cybersecurity, and you've got this big modernization project that's in place, and it crosses multiple agencies. Should you expect at this point, or should we expect, that the agency will have the proper cybersecurity practices, policies, governance in place to handle mobile, cloud, big data, analytics, and everything that typically gets talked about now in a modernization project?
In my experience, no, you shouldn't make that assumption. I think sometimes in these projects, the private sector looks to the government to have those in place, and the government looks to the private sector to implement those things along the way. So it's each doing one of these, and consequently it slips through the crack, and it's usually the government who comes back after the fact to say, oh, wait a minute, we're 3/4 of the way down the road, and we didn't consider building in security along the way. So as long as both the private and the public sector are focused on it, then I'm confident that a lot of the standards and frameworks that exist will take care of that. But that's got to be part of the discussion, in my opinion, and both sides of the table should be talking about that. Whether it's the NIST cybersecurity standard, or if it's COBIT, or there are dozens. And to me, I distill them. They're all trying to capture essentially the same thing. As long as you're having that discussion, it's okay. But if it's not talked about, then the hairs on the back of my neck go up.
So if you went back a number of years, it seemed like the delineation between what was truly sensitive data and what wasn't were reasonably clear. Now we've evolved into a world of big data, of analytics, of data association, and of massive increases in the quantity of publicly available data. And so the ability to do association and drive to what you would think of as sensitive information, it's much more daunting to manage for the government. So when you're dealing with these modernization projects, and they all flirt with this challenge, do you have any thoughts on how a Patrick or an Eric or we as Source Logic should go about managing those risks?
That's a great question. I think that we've seen example after example of where you can assemble classified data from a number of pieces of unclassified data. I won't get into the Snowden disclosures, but there was an awful lot of information that obviously shouldn't have been made public, and there are ways along any kind of even agile, you can build in security along the way. The reason why I'm kind of using these examples is that you can't have a former intelligence officer up here without talking about the cybersecurity threat. I don't mean to make anybody roll their eyes, but let's talk about a couple of facts. You look at the distributed denial of service attack that happened against the financial industry in 2012. You look at Sony, the Sony compromise surrounding the movie. You look at the OPM breach. We can go on and on and on. And my concern is that there's a number of insecurities that are out there already that make information available that could eventually be turned around and used against us as a nation. I know we're talking about application modernization, but in my opinion, if you're doing any work for the government or if you're doing any application work for the private sector, you have to consider the worst case scenario. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to over-engineer it. It doesn't mean that you're going to, make that application so locked down that no one can get to it. It's not what I mean at all. It's just as you go through the process of setting requirements or the detailed planning in the agile vernacular, are you doing the proper threat modeling? when you go to design, are you integrating some offensive people, personalities into that code so that you can say, hey, boy, I wouldn't make that variable available to the user because that could be exploited. All along the way, as long as you have, how can this be used against me, as long as you have that in your mind, you will engineer a better product, in my opinion. The thing that concerns me, let me go back to my War College days here just for a second. I know we're talking about application modernization. Let's talk a little bit about the evolution of warfare. I think gone are the days when a nation state or any other adversary of the United States will come against the government. Now, and we've all seen it, now the private sector is fair game. And all those examples, well, primarily the Sony example, but you could use Target, you can use a number of other examples. It's going to happen. The thing that concerns me is that traditional adversaries of the United States have wised up to where and how to hit us so they can deny it, and it can really impact us. I don't know if anyone here made the connection, but look at when those DDoS came, that DDoS came against the financial sector was just after we ramped up the sanctions against Iran. And I'm not attributing it to Iran, but I mean, obviously there's a great number of open source reports where you can say that it was Iran using a proxy who did that. So my point is, whether you're writing something for the government or writing it for the private sector, you better know how that could be misused. And you don't want to be the application that either opened up a door or captured data in such a way that it was subject to ransomware, for example. And there are certain ways that code is written that it would be less subject to ransomware than not. I'm just saying, take a look at it. And in the planning and the design and the deployment and the maintenance and even the decommissioning, look at these things to make sure that you're not bypassing a threat that could cause the nation or your company or your agency difficulty in the future.
All right. My head hurts, Mark. So Patrick, you live with the development, let's call it development best practices for cyber, kind of on a daily basis when you're in your project. Mark kind of went a little bit into that realm, but do you have any other thoughts on what this group can use for cyber development best practices?
So I think when you're looking at a Pega application, we start with a head start. And that head start is exemplified by the fact that the tool ships with a code scanning software that identifies the pieces of the application where bad actors are most likely to be able to implement vulnerabilities, or a careless developer is most likely to introduce a vulnerability. And as part of our deployment strategy, we know that code scanning tool must be used. But it's not just the platform that you develop, it's actually how you host it and how the data is transported. So we have a security first mentality at Accenture that boils over into our program. The way that we exemplify that is by living our credo of security first, and by having every person on the team be aware of the fact that when we develop, we think security first, and we boil that into the hosting, the development, the testing of the software, and then in how we work with the government subject matter experts. We don't keep the government security experts at arm's length. We welcome them into how we do our work. So we're very fortunate on our program to have such an enablement. And we make sure that they sit literally at the table with us as we do our Agile Scrum, so that they know what we're doing and how we're doing it, and can raise a flag. And then we say thank you. We say thank you.
All right. So Mark, I think we may have time after this, but this might be my last question. So we haven't talked a lot about cyber today, but you've kind of given a sobering picture, which is worthy given where we're at today. But do you have a couple of last suggestions for these folks that they should consider on modernization projects in terms of cybersecurity?
Yeah, just a little bit of a recap of what I said. Know the threat. Just keep that in mind. As Patrick said, that they do, that's great. Know the value of what you're providing. One value is if you keep those security threats and coding best practices in mind, then whatever you produce will be a stronger product. So know the value of that. And I don't mean necessarily a transactional value. I mean you're doing good work for the government for the most part. So show them, tell them. You know what? You say you've got a government security member on your team, but perhaps they're using an older standard, or perhaps they haven't considered a new threat like ransomware. You can bring that up and say, hey, we're all better for it. So we shouldn't be afraid of talking about that. That is valuable for the government and for the private sector. And know the collateral impacts of what you're trying to produce. I mentioned it earlier. What's the impact on my workflow? What are the dependencies? What are the interfaces that I'm going to have to manage? What are the user experiences that I'm going to have to contend with? What changes am I making that I'll have to socialize with the end users to make sure that it's okay? So that's pretty much it. Know the threat, know the value, and know the context of the application.
All right. Thank you, Mark. So first of all, questions may run long, so I want to thank you all so much now. I think this has been the deep dive that Pega was hoping we would get to, and you all have done an amazing job, so thank you. So let's take these last few minutes and let's open it up for questions. Go ahead.
When you were talking about the way that you have to go through the different, I guess, levels to tell them what they need to do. How do you, because you said you had to reteach or retool. To me, I guess being in the federal government, a lot of different agencies, the top management is the hardest people to retrain and retool. So how do you deal with that?
How do we get them to buy?
Right, so that's a great question. Well, typically, you want to incentivize them to learn and to at least become familiar with the technology or with the change in paradigm. So let's say we're moving away from our traditional development into this newfangled way of doing things. And the way for the folks all the way on the top, they understand one language, and that is, money, the financial value to the organization. At a lower tier, managers understand the value to their people and promotional potential. And at the ground level, folks are more concerned about learning something that would enhance their career. So, I think you meet each one at his or her point of need. For executive leadership, you have to sell them on the value proposition. And to correlate the understanding of that new platform or that new paradigm to their ability to make informed decisions, as opposed to making decisions blindly. You must first understand, that new platform, that new process, that new way of doing things before you can sell it to your organization and before you can defend it on the Hill if necessary.
I'll follow up on that by using a different M word, mission, and then the value to that mission. I have great praise for my partners in the Department of Justice, because one of the things that they understand and have understood from day one is that if you have the system tell a story where I enter in this data, but then the system produces something that has value to my mission and shows it to you, that's how you get your buy-in. So it's not just the money, but that sells. Money works, but if you can also pitch to mission so that it's easier to do the job and that there are values that they didn't anticipate coming from a software system, that can also promote within your organization.
And that term about value that they've spoken of, I think that applies regardless of who you're talking to. The head of an agency, you can pitch that value to them in their terms. But it's just as true pitching it to a CISO, for example, where you explain the value in their terms. So one might be money savings, better efficiency, better effectiveness, metrics, always a great capability. But to the CISO to say, look, this application allows you to obfuscate your executables. Oh, okay, boy, that's a good value. I got it. So value at all levels.
And just quickly, I would think you'd have to come with solid information of examples of outside your particular area, your particular agency, or that can sell management on the value of incorporating this. And I mean, list the examples, show specific examples in other organizations. Do you feel that's necessary? And would that help sell, get certain people to buy in? I understand that's a key element. That's what I've been told.
You need
I don't know
it.
if you consider it so.
Yep. I'll let you
Please,
feel
no,
that. So you need that definitely when you're talking about the executive level. You need those specific cases of where the approach has yielded results, and you need to bring that with you when you go and you ask for the blessing to actually go down the road of creating that value. But then when we talk about the grassroots, the working level of your organization, sometimes the value in and of itself, folks don't realize that it's there. They just end up seeing it, and it's almost subconscious that they're getting that value out of the system.
Right, and in addition, let me add one thing here. In addition to the value proposition we've been speaking about, I think you alluded to it a short while ago. There's, typically the folks up in the C wing, they're risk averse, right? So if you could sell them on the reduced risk profile of a particular scenario, a particular decision, I think you'll more quickly win their buy-in.
Last question.
How do you manage a modernization product while at the same time, potentially with the same staff and the budget, the O&M of your current applications while you're building this MVP? I mean, how do you balance, say, oh, bug came in, oh, everyone's swarm, MVP's now delayed. What's the best practice on dealing with that?
So I can't speak from practicality because, frankly, we don't. At this point, we are fortunate in that our entire focus is on getting the MVP to a point where it is successful and deployed and transitioned to. However, following the release of that MVP, we have a strategy for leveraging some of the same teams that we have in the Scrum right now for those production level defects. Because yes, there will be defects in production. Let's live with that. But then again, I'll point back at what I said earlier about letting the government and trusting the government to own the decisions as to what is the most important thing to do. We'll do that then too. We have a lot of trust in our relationship, and frankly, I trust that our team is going to be able to both keep up with what we need to do in terms of production support, but also deliver on the promise of the new. The answer certainly isn't throw money at it. The answer is collaborate and decide what's most important to do at this moment, and then every 2 weeks, groom that backlog, groom it, and then roll with it.
And timing is a resource too. How much time are you devoted towards the legacy versus the MVP?
Right.
So if you only have $1 to spend, can we divide that up in a way that starts to sunset one while you're ramping up the other? Right. We just didn't have the choice at NSA. We had to keep doing the things that we were already doing while we're bringing new things online too.
Right.
So.
And you're always going to see that type of dovetailing, right, where you have the existing system that you're hoping to replace running in tandem with this new system, and that's where intelligent and smart transition planning comes in.
So, are we okay? Fire away.
All right. So in the modernization projects, from my experience, I've seen that code is sitting there for 10, 15 years. User is no more there. All new users, they don't know all the business rules. So when you go to the business rule, extract the rules from the business user, and when you implement it, all these logics didn't go there. And when the field people are working, they said, okay, I'm taking some experience from my tax project, income tax project. So they said, no, this is not the way, so this would be, there are some rules there in the old system, legacy is not there. So how will you handle those type of scenarios? I mean, it is very difficult to extract rule from code. And we have to trust on the people, your users are available now, but still there is some gap both into the modern system.
We're lucky because the people that we work with are representatives of the field.
Okay.
So when we look at our room where we actually build this present program, it is the Scrum teams and pods. And by the way, the room is constructed for the purpose of the program. It wasn't a cube farm that we jumped into and said, go. We're surrounded by representatives from the building, and you are too right now, but that's another story entirely. We're surrounded by the people that actually know how the business works. And we have the benefit of every day being able to live and understand what they actually need. We ask, they tell. But then right now, even though we are months away from a deployment to production, and that's not a quote of a roadmap timeframe, but they are working within the building to say, this is how we're solving these problems. It's a different approach from what you're used to. It is so different, it is impossible to comprehend how one could turn into another. You can't just sprout wings and then fly. So that work is ongoing, and frankly, I feel blessed that we have the opportunity to work in such a place that we've put in place those subject matter experts who are both facing us, the integrator, but also facing the rest of the organization as proponents of the approach and proponents of the system that's going to come out.
All right.
So, I have time for one question. Yeah, in terms of modernization, how do you approach emergent design and emergent architecture?
Is this question directed to me?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, sure.
Because you're the architects.
Well, so let me just piggyback on that previous question, because I think you suggested a bottom-up approach in that you're going to take a look at your code and try to derive business rules from your code. That's a very interesting approach. Most of the successful approaches that I've seen is kind of middle out, right? So we do top-down and bottom-up and somehow find some happy middle ground there that gives us the type of extraction rate that we're looking for in terms of accurately capturing the business rules. But so in terms, now to address your questions, in terms of how do we handle emerging technology and how do we handle the architecture and design around those? Well, couple guideposts. First of all, we want to look at systems that allow us to design from an open architecture perspective. We don't want to be in closed systems. We don't want to be locked into any particular vendor. So we want to ensure that the vendors we select, the systems we select, have an open architecture that is extensible, that they're open source friendly, so to speak. In other words, that lots of these open source systems and frameworks that are out there are supported by those platforms. Then thirdly, we want to ensure that we can grow incrementally. We don't want to use a big bang approach because that could be rather costly. So we want to grow incrementally. And those type of goals guide our selection and our architectural and design perspective in terms of how we go from zero to full product. And that occurs typically over a very lengthy period. But to the points made earlier, we want to ensure that we have incremental value delivered to the customer.
All right. So thank you all so much for your time. We hope you found the panel valuable. To our panel members, you all have done a great job. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Thanks,